I just wanted to read a little bit about your bio from the website. So, Myesha Braden is a civil rights attorney at the Alliance for Justice, where she's director of special justice initiatives. Her career has focused on improving the administration of justice systems to ensure equality and fairness for people of color and the poor. In 2017, she became the inaugural director for the Criminal Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she led strategic litigation to improve the provision of indignant defense services and prevent the criminalization of poverty through policing, prosecution, and court practices that results in the incarceration of individuals for their inability to pay fines, fees, and bail. She served the United States Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor in both the criminal and civil rights division, and a trial attorney in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. She has earned numerous awards, including the 2011 Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award and the 2007 National Crime Victims' Rights Service Award. In 2014, she was detailed by the Department of Justice to serve the Obama administration as a senior policy advisor in the White House Domestic Policy Council and the Office of the National Drug Control Policy, where she worked to develop and promote implementation of a broad range of criminal justice and civil rights policies and programs. Our first question is, could you briefly explain your role in the Alliance for Justice and the goals that you're working towards in the organization?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to speak with you this evening. I am relatively new to the Alliance for Justice. The organization is more than 40 years old and has traditionally focused on courts and the way that people engage with courts, looking at judicial nominees on one side of the house, and the other side of the house is something that we call bolder advocacy, which looks at the way that people advocate for different laws or concerning different issues, making sure that they are able to stay within the confines of federal not-for-profit and tax laws. And when I joined Alliance for Justice this past March, it was to stand up a program called Building the Bench, which focuses on making sure that the people who are actually nominated for federal judicial appointments, Supreme Court, Circuit Court, District Court, actually reflect two important aspects of diversity and inclusion. First of all, traditional, quote, traditional demographic forms of diversity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, religious preference, and also experiential diversity. A lot of people think that being a lawyer is just kind of the end of the story, but it's not. There are lots of different ways to practice law. And what we have found is that people who become judges, by and large, particularly federal judges, have two very similar points in their background, overwhelmingly. They have worked for big law firms. The vast majority of federal judges come from big law. And the second pot, those significantly smaller than law firm judges who come from law firms, significantly higher than judges who say come from public defender or civil rights backgrounds, are prosecutors. So if you only have two aspects of the practice of law represented, big law firms and prosecutors, what you're missing from that puzzle are people who have represented non-institutional, non-corporate clients. So Building the Bench pushes to increase the number of judges who come from non-traditional judiciary backgrounds, more public defenders, more civil rights attorneys, more union attorneys, more people who've done employment defense, more people who've worked for legal aid and represented people who are indigent and poor. We think a bench that is inclusive of all different aspects of the practice of law and of all different aspects of the demographics of American society provides a better quality of justice for the people who engage in those courtrooms. And that's particularly true on courts of appeal, like the Supreme Court and the federal circuit courts, because those judges are making decisions based on consensus discussions. It's not one judge making a ruling, it's 3 or 9 judges making a ruling, and they have discussions about what the law means when applies to a given set of facts. And if your experience is only informed by one area of the practice of law, or if everyone on that 3-judge panel or on that Supreme Court is the same race or the same sex, or they come from the same socioeconomic strata, or they all went to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and they didn't go to any other law schools, you're not going to have a very rich conversation. You're not bringing a very full set of perspectives to decision making. And as a result, it can lower the quality and potentially the accuracy of decision making. So it's an important part of improving the administration of justice, raising the quality of justice that is received by anyone who interacts with the courts, is the work of building the bench. And that's what I'm doing at Alliance for Justice.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience of being a civil rights lawyer?
Yes, I think everywhere that I've been since joining the Civil Rights Division of DOJ in 2008, I have been a civil rights attorney. Even when I was at the White House, when I helped to start this criminal justice project at the Lawyers Committee, even now, because what a civil rights attorney does essentially is focus on advocating for those people whose rights, A, were not necessarily originally guaranteed by the Constitution, and to ensure through our advocacy that no person's experience of what it means to be present in America or a citizen of the United States is different based on a demographic characteristic. So that goes with me in all the work that I'm doing. Starting in the Civil Rights Division in 2008, my practice was primarily prosecution. I prosecuted hate crimes, human trafficking cases, police misconduct cases, any violation of a federal civil rights law. And that informs the policy work that I've done since. The policy work has focused more on the backside of criminal justice and the front side of criminal justice, looking at how we create opportunities so that people don't become engaged in the criminal justice system. If they do become engaged in the criminal justice system, making sure that there is fairness and not retributive punishment, so to speak. And once they've gone through the criminal justice system, making sure that they come out and they actually have an opportunity to fully re-engage with society. With leaving the Justice Department, my work has focused more on how people are engaging with the justice system. Now I focus on judges and making sure that people are aware of the importance of judges to their everyday life, making sure that people understand how important diversity and inclusion on the bench is to protecting everyday rights that you depend on. And at the Lawyers Committee, the focus is on how the justice system is particularly harsh on people who are poor, and how oftentimes behaviors that are associated with poverty, like paying a fine late or being unable to pay a fine, what's often resulting in incarceration for people simply because they were poor. And how once people who are poor become engaged in the system, if they can't afford a lawyer, they're indigent, whether or not the system is providing an adequate system of public free representation to them as they are entitled to, if they are engaged with the criminal justice system. So all of the, as I was saying earlier, all of my work since joining the Department of Justice since joining the Civil Rights Division, because I was at the Department of Justice for a while before I joined the Civil Rights Division, for 7 years actually before I joined the Civil Rights Division. But all of the work that I've done since then has centered on those types of things, making sure that the justice system takes care of those people whose civil rights are threatened, and making sure that when people are engaging with the justice system because they've been accused of a crime, that they are not more likely to have been accused of a crime because of a characteristic that they are not more likely to serve a longer sentence because of a characteristic, to make sure that they are not more likely to lack proper representation because of a particular characteristic.
In what ways do you think we can help Black, Indigenous, and people of color who were failed by the system?
That question can have a lot of pieces. I think from what I do, from a civil rights practice, I look at it in terms of how do we make our systems more fair, and how do we make sure that everyone is represented in the system. We are a constitutional democracy. That means the power flows from the people. And anything happening in a government institution should be informed by the will of the people. So when the people, particularly poor people, Black people, Indigenous people, when they become disengaged from the system because of multiple reasons, either they believe that the system is not there for them because they're not seeing any benefit, or they believe that the system is actually out to harm them because their only engagement with the system is with over-policing. People often become disenchanted and they disassociate from their civic duty, from their rights to engage with the government and to actually have influence over how the government operates in their daily lives. And I should add, we talk a lot about voting, because clearly voting is one way to do that. But there are things that we can do as private citizens. We can pay attention to, for example, if we've got a local school system, what does the suspension rate look like in my local school system? Are Black people, Indigenous people, poor people, Latinos, are people being suspended disproportionately? Are they suffering from in-school punishment disproportionately? Are they being left out of gifted and talented and advanced level courses? You know, what is happening in my school system, and what types of rules and regulation is my school board passing that is having an effect on these things? If I'm concerned about policing in my hometown, who am I electing to mayor? Who am I electing as my local sheriff? Who am I electing as my city council that determines the budget, that influences the targeting of the police, the types of crimes that the police are focused on? If that's my only lever, how do I engage that? Am I attending the city council meeting? Am I voting? Am I speaking up about how the budget is being spent? And that, from the school board to the city council to the state legislature to the federal legislature, those are the opportunities that people often miss along the way, to pay attention to how the system is helping some and failing others.
What do you think is the most important thing to talk about when you're talking about racial injustice?
First of all, I don't think there's a right answer to that question. So I'm just going to give you the answer that comes to mind for me in this moment. I think that economics, housing, plays a huge role in the continuation of racial disparity in the United States. Education plays a huge role, and it's not something that we focus on often enough. We spend a lot of time talking about the criminal justice system. That's work that I've done for years. I think it's important. However, the fact of the matter is, the amount of engagement that a person has with the criminal justice system depends exactly on where they live. So if they don't have the economic wherewithal to move or live in a neighborhood where there's less policing, if they live in a neighborhood where the tax base is low because people's wages are low or depressed, or people are unemployed, that's going to be directly reflected in the quality of the school system, because funding for schools is based on the tax base. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, your school is going to be underfunded. The same thing applies with your engagement with the criminal justice system. For whatever reason, traditionally, quality of life crimes, so to speak, that are more associated with people of color are more heavily policed. So hanging out on a street corner, playing loud music. People have passed ordinances controlling how high a person's pants are. You know, moving up to marijuana and tougher drug sentences or things like that. So somebody has made a decision to police a certain area, and often if the area looks impoverished, police make assumptions about how much crime is going to happen in that neighborhood. So I think, this is my answer for today, I might change it tomorrow, but I do think that we have to pay more attention to economics and housing because they affect everything else. And if you look at the history of this country, particularly with redlining and the way that home loans have been delved out, certain people had access to get loans to be able to buy homes, move into the suburbs, and certain people did not. You know, coming back from World War II, white soldiers had access to get these loans and buy homes and establish a base of wealth that expanded generations, and Black soldiers did not have the same access. So economic opportunity and housing access, I think more than anything else, is where we should be focusing.
And how do you think we could educate people on things like that?
I think it's very important that we teach American history in a more inclusive and thorough way. I think by nature, when only one group of people is allowed access to education, then that one group of people becomes the experts. And their expertise is going to be informed by their experience. And those are people who write the textbooks and determine the lesson plans. So for generations, you have people who have learned American history through a particular lens, and that lens is only represented by and large by one group, and it's overwhelmingly a white male gaze. So the way that we introduce children to American history is problematic, and it just kind of compounds on itself over time, so that by the time you get to college and maybe you're looking at things through a more critical lens, it's harder to accept certain things because now you spent your whole 12 previous years of education learning that things are a certain way because of a certain thing. And that foundational knowledge is now going to inform everything that you learn. And it's really difficult for people to understand concepts like institutionalized racism, how an individual doesn't have to have hatred in their heart for a group of people, to be suffering the effects of racism that has been institutionalized in our educational systems, in our banking systems, in our criminal justice systems, et cetera. So making sure that we are more informed. If I had a magic wand, I would probably take the economic incentive out of our journalism so that we were reading better quality things in the newspaper and watching better quality things on the television news. But I don't have a magic wand, but one thing that we can do is pay attention to the textbooks that our kids are getting, going to those school board meetings, looking at what the educational requirements are in schools and et cetera, and really working to improve the foundational information that we are providing to kids that they will build on for the rest of their lives.
Do you think that the country is at a complete divide on racial justice, or are we starting to come together?
I don't know that we are necessarily coming together. And I also don't know that we are necessarily more divided. I think people are more comfortable expressing views on race that are not widely held. And we have media, television, internet, that kind of puts it out there. So we focus on that. The wrinkle in my belief is, we've started to see elections where people who either hold those beliefs or simply want to take advantage of those beliefs so that they can attain positions of power are attaining positions of power. So things are magnified, but I don't think we've had much of a change. And I think it's very difficult to have a change when it comes to race when we really have never had the discussions that we need to have. We've never had an honest discussion about, even forget going back to slavery, just look at what happened with Jim Crow coming out of Reconstruction, looking at what was happening in the early 1900s with access to things like education, economic capital, housing, laws that specifically criminalized behavior of formerly enslaved people so that those people would still be working for free. They just worked through convict leasing instead of being entitled or called slaves. So examining the very real structures that were put in place post-Reconstruction that we continue to deal with and are having trouble dismantling, we haven't discussed what that means for us. And we haven't tried to develop any solutions to address problems that we just don't talk about. So if we can't even talk about it, there's really no way for us to move forward from it. We can cover it over for a while and it might stay suppressed. But if we don't really deal with it, it's always gonna bubble back up.
Do you have any advice for those who are considering human rights and civil rights law?
You may have noticed that things that are referred to as civil rights, human rights in other countries are referred to as civil rights in the United States. And there's traditionally been a pushback to consider the civil rights struggle, the US civil rights struggle, as a human rights struggle. So the first thing I would do is to encourage you to look at human rights and civil rights as the same. The one difference being human rights, you have a little more room to maneuver because you're focusing on international conventions instead of just US-based laws. But the work is essentially the same, addressing racial injustice from a human rights perspective is essentially the same work as addressing racial injustice within the confines of the United States. Protecting women from domestic violence and from excessive violence and allowing women better access to education, ensuring that there is clean air and clean water, ensuring that migrations due to climate change are not disproportionately affecting minority groups is not that different from making sure that a dependence on coal and fossil fuels and people being forced to leave neighborhoods where they've lived for generations because now their water is polluted. You know, those things are not that different. So considering them within the same context, making sure that you are consuming media, information, education that allows you to focus on what's happening on the international stage, because it may give you more tools from the perspective of your civil rights work here in the United States, I think is great. My focus has been civil rights. I have a younger sister who's just graduated from law school, and her focus is human rights. So I like to think that I informed that in some way, shape, or form. But again, the work is very similar. If you like to travel, if you have a flair for languages, then I might nudge you more towards human rights. If you maybe have a slightly stronger tolerance for law that is a little bit ambiguous and that you are creating, human rights might be a better way to go, because civil rights in the United States is statutory. You still need to bring your creativity to the work, because any given statute, you know, and any piece of law can say many different things depending on the creativity that a person is bringing to it. But just consuming as much information as you can about issues of belonging, issues of equality and fairness. If those are things that you are passionate about, then I think civil rights or human rights would be a good fit for you.
So now we're just going to open the floor up to anybody else who has questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I was just wondering, through your whole career, what was like the most challenging thing for you? Like, what's been your biggest challenge?
There are not a lot of Black women who are prosecutors. And in prosecuting your cases, you spend a lot of time with cops, quite honestly. Federally, they're FBI agents, and locally, they're police, but they're still cops. And the prosecutor leads investigations. The prosecutors leads cases. So being a Black woman leading the work of usually all white men with guns, so there's a certain amount of testosterone in that. Taking orders from any woman is not their favorite thing. Taking orders from a Black woman is definitely not their favorite thing. So that was tough. The time that I spent as a prosecutor was tough, and being able to manage and maneuver relationships with FBI agents. Sometimes things went beautifully. You have, you know, people who are confident, everybody's focused on getting the job done, people are mission focused. But sometimes you get people who are, they go. And a woman prosecutor who becomes an attorney general, or in my heart, imagine what those women had to do in order to attain those positions.
I have another question. What made you want to become a civil rights attorney?
I don't think I ever really thought of doing anything else. I associated being an attorney with people who were civil rights attorneys. That's what being an attorney meant to me. My grandmother used to have this collection of encyclopedias. It was called the Anthology of Negro History, I think was the name. And, you know, there was a section there on the law. So it was all Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and the work that lawyers had done in order to improve the condition of Black people. And I never wanted to do anything else from the time I was about 8 years old. There are certain, I'm saying this now because I'm 47 and I can look back. I did not know this when I was 27 or 17. But there are certain gifts or talents or skills that came to me naturally. I love speaking. I love writing. I love problem solving. And all of those things are necessary in order to be a good attorney. And all of those things are necessary in order to be a good civil rights attorney. So I am lucky in that I knew from an early age that I wanted to do something that fit with natural gifts and talents that I had. And I suppose at some point in time, I could have made a different decision and gone to a firm or practiced some other area of law. But even when I was not a civil rights attorney, I was trying to get there. I started out, my first job out of law school was at the Corporations Counsel office in DC. It's now called the DC Attorney General's office. Because I applied, but I couldn't get in at the Justice Department. So I spent the first 2 years of my career doing child exploitation cases, child abuse and neglect cases, civil prosecution when children had been abused or neglected. Finally, the Department of Justice was hiring in something that I had an interest in, but it still wasn't civil rights. So I said, well, you know, I'll just get in here. I had a degree, I wanted to focus on environmental justice, and I went to law school with that focus. So I had a degree in forestry, and I had a certificate in environmental law from Tulane. At the time, it was one of the best environmental law programs in the country. So I said, you know, I'm going to go to the Environment Division. It gets me in the door at DOJ. And I got in. I applied again to the Civil Rights Division. I still didn't get in. So I said, you know, I spent this time doing this child abuse and neglect work. There's another opening in the criminal division, and they're also doing human trafficking, which I know they do some of in the Civil Rights Division. So let me apply for that. In DOJ, you don't just move, you have to reapply for a job. So I applied, I moved to the criminal division, and I was prosecuting child exploitation cases with a heavy focus on human trafficking. Got to spend some time in Indonesia as intermittent legal advisor for human trafficking, and developed an expertise, an unusual area of expertise. And applied again a third time. It took me 3 tries before I was finally hired in the Civil Rights Division at DOJ. And I'm like, finally, I'm there. And then when I get there, my deputy had also applied 3 times before he got in. And my chief had also applied 3 times before he got in. And I'm like, well, what's the deal? And then I was finally on the hiring council. And from, say, maybe 10 positions, we were getting 700 applicants. It was just too many people. But people who continued to apply, people remembered. Note, if you know you immediately, but don't give up. Keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. If you really want to do it and you have the skills, if you don't give up, you'll get there. So that's a little side note.
Question. It said that you had set up the Council on Women and Girls Advancing Equity Initiative. Can you speak on that?
I worked with a whole group of other people to do that. At the time that I was called MBK, My Brother's Keeper, and there was a huge outcry from women of color that there was nothing for my sisters. Because MBK focused on young men of color. So the Council on Women and Girls, along with the section that I was in and the Domestic Policy Council, which was Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity, and some people from the Office of Public Engagement, we started to work together to see, well, what can we do? We're not going to recreate MBK, but we know that this is an important issue. So we started by doing a report. What is the government doing when it comes to women and girls of color? What resources are we providing? What problems are we trying to solve related to women and girls of color? And then once we produced that report, it gave us some ideas about what was necessary. And then the next step was, well, we know what we've been doing. This is what we will do now. This is how we will bring this work into each government agency. And then the next step of that, which happened after I left, someone else figured out, well, how do we get money to do this and not just rely on the government, but how do we bring in universities to do research and to develop a deeper understanding concerning issues of concern to women and girls, which is something new, and it's something that I take with me. That work that I did in the White House was just a new way of lawyering that I had not been introduced to before. Obviously, you have a lot of resources from the perch of the White House, but having access to experts who study specific issues and can come to the table and talk with advocates about problems that they had identified, and being able to apply the resources of the government to expertise and information was intriguing to me. And when I left the White House to go back to DOJ, I was no longer satisfied prosecuting. I was like, I see so many different ways that I can actually help people still lawyering. I need to figure out how I can do these other things. And also I had deep concerns about prosecution. In prosecuting the human trafficking cases, which by the time I went to the White House, I had stopped. I refused to do anymore because there were mandatory minimum sentences with trafficking cases, and trafficking is awful and needs to be prosecuted, but people were getting 15-year mandatory minimum sentences when people who beat immigrants to death were getting half that time. And I just started paying attention to inequality in the sentencing scheme and the way that we focused our resources on prosecution. And I, became concerned that I didn't want to be a part of the problem, which is why I stopped prosecuting trafficking cases. But I thought there were better ways for me to be part of the solution. And the work that I did at the White House, including standing up that equity portfolio, working on looking at the way that we delivered military equipment to our police and whether or not that was a good thing and whether we needed to make some changes there, looking at the federal government's hiring of people with disabilities and whether or not we were doing all we could to bring people with disabilities into the federal workforce. I like the idea of using policy and programming and bringing experts together to create solutions. So I didn't know that detail was coming. I'm glad I was prepared and able to say yes when it did come about. May I ask you questions?
Yeah, of course. That's all, yeah.
Can you tell me about some of the things that you all at HER are focused on? Yeah. I know that I'm assuming you're all journalists in training, or you've got an idea about journalism or writing. But are there particular issues that you're focused on?
Yeah, so I think all of us are a little bit different. I myself am a journalism major, and a lot of the pieces I write about are women's health issues, current events, things that are going on in DC and in the city. If any of you guys want to talk about what you like to write about.
Yeah, I feel like everybody kind of picks their own focus. Like for me, I talk a lot about fashion and specifically like sustainable, ethical fashion. That's all I really like about her campus. A lot of us actually aren't journalist majors. I'm a PR major. I started as a journalism major, but a lot of us, I think our editor-in-chief is, I think she's in international relations. So we're all kind of like different topics and we write about everything. The organization as a whole, like Her Campus Nationals, is more focused on like women empowerment and everything like that, but we kind of write about everything.
Okay. There's a lot of room in the advocacy space for people from both journalism, public relations, communications backgrounds. As a DOJ person, I was not aware of that because when you're prosecuting cases or working for the Department of Justice at all, you don't talk to the press, you don't engage with the press. So I had no idea how important messaging and storytelling is to advocacy and being able to push issues forward. So when I was at the Lawyers Committee, now at Alliance for Justice, the communication side of our work is among the most important thing that we do. And even though I'm an attorney, not a communications expert, I understand that I can't do my job without the communications team doing their job. I can't do my job if I can't tell a good story and make people actually care about whatever issue I'm trying to work on. So I hope that as you all are going forward in your career, that you keep in mind advocacy, issue advocacy, progressive campaigns, and the like as a field of possibility for you.
Did you go straight from undergrad to law school?
Kind of. I graduated from college about 6 months early, a semester early. So I worked for that little bit, then I went to law school. There's a big push now. My sister did the same thing, but there is a push among law schools to have students who are a little bit older, who come to the table a little bit more mature. So you are finding people who maybe did Teach for America for a couple of years before going to law school, or worked in some field, developed some type of work experience before going to law school. I'm seeing that quite a lot.
Has COVID impacted your work a lot? Have you noticed any changes or shifts?
I started at Alliance for Justice on March 9th. The office shut down on March 15th. So I had exactly 1 week in the office with my team, and just had to learn on my feet. We all had to learn on our feet. So we do a lot of Zoom, lots of phone calls, lots of Microsoft Teams. There's no travel, which normally I would have been doing in this work. I kind of appreciate that, because working for the Department of Justice, I spent a lot of time on planes. There were times when I might travel 3 out of every 4 weeks. So I'm not at all upset about the fact that I have not had to travel as much, but I think everybody's just had to adjust and give everybody a bit of grace. Things are not going to work the way they used to work. We just need to figure out this new way.
Speaking about like COVID, do you think like people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color have been like affected more so with COVID?
I know so, because people of color, Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, are more likely to work in jobs where they can't work from home. So they are suffering higher rates of exposure. They're also less likely to have insurance. So when they get sick, they tend to be sicker before they ever get to the hospital or the doctor. They are more likely to live in places where the hospital, if they have nearby access to a hospital, people in urban areas do, people in rural areas don't. Those hospitals are likely to be lower quality and to have fewer resources. Also, going back to environmental issues, people of color are significantly more likely to live near polluting industries, and exposure to airborne particulates make you more likely to have heart disease and asthma and the type of underlying conditions that make COVID more deadly should you contract it. I think there was a study a while ago, 70% of all Black people in the United States live within 50 miles of some type of coal or electrical polluting type plant. Going right back to housing and economic development.
I was gonna ask, is the Rights Alliance for Justice, are they doing anything about the Supreme Court nomination going on right now?
That's almost all that we are doing right now.
I figured as much. Can you talk about it a bit?
Trying to make people aware that it does not have to be a foregone conclusion that Amy Barrett's nomination gets through, making sure that people are as informed as possible about what her position on the Supreme Court, how it will affect potentially cases that are going up, making sure that people understand that so that they can hold their senators accountable for the votes that they make, is a big part of what we are doing right now. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. From an advocacy perspective, if you see civil rights being violated or you see people being denied their civil rights, you can file a case, but before you file the case, you know the path that the case is going to take. And if you know that the judges who are likely to hear your case have a baked in perspective, it suggests to you that you may not achieve fairness with your case. So again, that undermines the quality of justice and it undermines people's trust in the legitimacy of decisions. But as an advocate, you have to make a decision whether you wait to bring that case. So if you've got an Amy Barrett on the Supreme Court and someone is being denied access to reproductive health care that they are entitled to, do you really want to bring that case if it's going to go before her and then possibly create law that is going to be the law of the land for generations? Or do you now have to wait until the court changes? So having people understand how the decisions that the Supreme Court, or who sits on the Supreme Court, and even the lower court, because there was a bit of a battle when she was appointed to the Seventh Circuit, how those circuit court judges' decisions affect daily life and daily decisions, from access to reproductive health care to access to the franchise of voting, to determinations about whether police will be held accountable for certain behavior, whether qualified immunity will be applied. All of these everyday real things, these real decisions, the Supreme Court only hears 100 cases a year on average, but their decisions affect millions for generations. A president at most can be president for 8 years, and that's it, they're gone. You can sit on the Supreme Court for 30 years or more and be affecting the quality of justice that people are receiving, the amount of civil rights that people are receiving, the amount of fairness that people have an expectation to in the courts. So at Alliance for Justice, we are focusing very heavily on this nomination. And again, trying to make sure that people are as informed as possible about what this means potentially for rights that they are very, very much fighting hard to protect and expand.
Do you have any closing notes that you want to say before wrapping up?
Sure. I'd just like to say thank you. I'm glad that you guys were interested in hearing what I have to say. I encourage you to go online, take a look at Alliance for Justice's website, and see what we are talking about. We also, we have Twitter. The organization has a Twitter presence. I have a Twitter presence. Our president has a Twitter presence. Take a look at some of the things that we are talking about, and see if maybe it's something you might be interested in writing about, so that you people your age can sometimes not care what people my age have to say. So if they're hearing it from you, that's a very important thing to be happening. So I encourage you guys to pay attention and use your gifts that you have, use your skills and your education, and inform somebody else.
On behalf of Her Campus American, we really like to thank you for this opportunity and like speaking to us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Take care.